Welcome to Ruined by the Internet. I'm Gareth King. Today we're asking, has the Internet ruined reputation management? By creating an environment of radically decentralised authority, the Internet shattered a slow, controlled process, turning it into a fast, volatile and potentially permanent crisis cycle. To help us understand the power of digital transparency, we're joined by Stuart Thomson, a public affairs and political engagement specialist, author, and founder of reputation management consultancy CWE Communications. Stuart, thank you so much for joining us and welcome to the show.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me on, Gareth. It's a very kind of you to invite me along.
I'm keen to see what we can uncover today, but before we get into it, can you tell us a bit about the work that you do and the journey that's led you to this point?
Yeah, it's been a bit of a different route into, I suppose, communications as a whole, but particularly reputation management. I'd always been fascinated by current affairs and politics. Did a PhD in politics and then thought, well, what do I do now? I mean, I'd love to sort of work in around politics, but how do you do that? So I wrote around to all the political lobbying firms that I could find. There was a book called Dodd's Parliamentary Companion that had all the sort of pen portraits of politicians, sort of MPs from the Westminster Parliament in, and in the back of that, all the lobbying firms. This seems really weird now, but anyway, all the lobbying firms used to advertise. So I just wrote around to them and said, look, can I have a job? Unsurprisingly, most of them wrote back and went, no, but one or two did write back and I came down to them. But then I got an internship with a PR communications firm, and that was the start of the journey. And then I worked for a couple of big global law firms, again, doing public affairs, so political engagement work, and then increasingly more and more around reputation management. And then for the last sort of 3 years or so, I've been running it as myself as CWE Communications. So I've got a couple of books out again about reputation management, public affairs as well. So that's how I've ended up covering all these sorts of issues. Yeah.
What a varied repertoire you've got there. But, we are here today to discuss the impact that the digital world has had on reputation management and communications, I guess, in a wider sense. As someone who's just outlined such an extensive experience in this area, what surprised you the most so far about how things have played out since the arrival of the internet and various forms of tech?
I think it's, I suppose, two things. One is, this is going to sound obvious on one level, but it's just the speed of change. So when I was doing political monitoring work, what was going on in and around Parliament, I was literally getting the printouts from what was happening in Parliament, cutting them out, pasting it, so proper cutting and pasting, and then faxing it off, through to now, literally nanoseconds later, rumours go around, you have to get a response out. But I think the challenge that comes with that, and I suppose this is a reflection, is that despite lots of us doing this sort of work, trying to warn organisations about the need for preparedness, still many aren't. They aren't quite ready for what happens if something goes wrong. And I think you see that particularly just in recent weeks and months with cyber attacks. I'm not suggesting for a minute these organisations weren't prepared, but the fact is that whoever was doing the hacking, and you can read the media as to, whether it was, hackers or state-sponsored or whatever. I make no judgment at all about these things. But the fact it happened, they got in, they caused massive damage, and they struggle. They don't quite know how to communicate with their staff. They don't quite know how to communicate with their customers. And of course, that then leads into government as well. And what role does government have in this? And what do companies in particular want from the government in terms of help or support or wider communications as well? It still surprises me that many are still caught on the hop. And frankly, that's pretty inexcusable and is a risk that isn't being managed by any organisation.
Right. You raised a couple of points there. One, firstly, obviously around the speed that everything happens at, which is ironically, as you said, the preparedness. You'd think at speed when you need to operate so fast, you would invest more in there. I think the other interesting thing is that we know that this world is now 24/7, and the speed that it can be activated within that 24/7 is almost instantaneous. Does that mean that this need for constant vigilance in the sense of preparedness or reaction, has that made reputation management now really like a 24/7, 365 job, and a potentially damaging crisis right around the clock? I can imagine once upon a time it would have been a lot easier to manage when you had a little bit of lag before stories might get out or you had time to respond. But it feels like now people just want instant action on everything, and you need to be able to give them that. But In that sense, what are some of the different approaches to handling that? You mentioned governments and organizations and even potentially down to people. Like what are people doing to try and deal with this current situation?
Yeah, you could touch a number of relevant points, Gareth. I mean, I think in the first instance, that speed of response, and it's not that all organizations have to have all the information at their fingertips straight away. That's just simply not going to happen. Instead, it's more about just making sure, that a vacuum isn't created that allows others, ill-informed pundits, tweeters, messengers, Xers, whatever, to fill that space, and that's what the media cover. So even if it's, look, this is early doors, we don't really know what's going on, we're doing everything we can. As soon as we have more information, we'll absolutely be on it, and then you can provide that information as and when it comes available. That's a perfectly acceptable starting point. Nobody expects you to have everything straight away. But when you don't do that, when there is that silence, then others come in. I suppose it's even worse than 24/7, 365, again, whichever you want to say, because it's global as well. So again, another foundation, solid foundation has to be built on having access to that information, of knowing what is being said and done about you across the world. And that means that threat, that attack, could be an attack, could be self-inflicted, could be an attack from outside, could be something you've done, could be something an individual member of the team has done. The bigger corporate structure may not be paying particular attention to. All of those things are risks that need to be managed. So speed is of the essence, but it doesn't have to be instant explanation, instant information all the time. You do have a period of time to get some information out there. And the other part of that is just making sure you got the channels, so that in advance, so you're not just relying on the traditional press release or media statement or whatever to get things out to rectify the situation. Actually, in advance of these things, you have channels. LinkedIn, Twitter, TikTok, whatever is right for your organization, that you have those in place already so that you can then get that information out there and people can find out what the real position is.
Right. That makes total sense in a contingency plan if a certain situation was to kind of happen. But what about when the unexpected happens? Whether it's real, whether it's fake, that's kind of irrelevant. We know just how quickly something can spread online. So would you say in the current landscape with, let's say, billions of users that can potentially become those attackers to any person, organization, government, company, whatever it is, who holds the real power in reputation management today? Is it the PR team with the reach and the right channels? Or is it potentially an anonymous online user with a grudge and the right audience? Like, who wins this battle?
Yeah, I mean, look, these are huge challenges. There's no one answer, I don't think, to any of these things. So I suppose my challenge back to you would be that for most organizations, looking at the risks, most organizations will know where their risks are or could be. I'm not going to say that you can plan for absolutely everything, but for most organizations, you'll know where the problems may lie or could lie if X, Y, and Z happens. So I think that scenario planning, again, is pretty fundamental to that crisis situation scenario. In terms of who holds the sort of the lever to that reputation, if you think about reputation as being a sort of a bank account, if you like, you pay into the bank account. So those, as you suggested, there was sort of well-honed PR teams, maybe an activist CEO, maybe, the way that you do. I mean, I know this, again, in the current political climate, DEI issues, but the way they treat the environment, their employees, open up to those from various and diverse backgrounds and the opportunities given to them and provided to them. All of that stuff, if you like, really important, will vary between organizations, but pretty fundamentally important. You pay into that bank account. If a problem arises, the challenge comes in, it's a withdrawal from that bank account, in essence. You can take a few hits. The challenge comes is if you keep making those withdrawals, or those withdrawals are happening, and that balance gets to zero or goes into overdraft, then you're in real problems. So if you are most organizations, if you've done that reputation building, you can weather that storm a little bit more effective. You've got some leeway to deliver that. But I mean, you might get interventions from regulators anyway, depending on what it is. But, you'll get regulatory interventions. You'll get politicians saying outrageous things about you. You'll get governmental action. You'll get boycotts that are effective on your products and those sorts of things. That's where the real problem comes. And that's why you see Some crises are absolutely fundamental, and some companies and organizations and individuals go, they disintegrate, company fails or whatever. Others, such as the likes of VW, for instance, with their Dieselgate, it sounded absolutely fundamental to that organization. But the reality was that because people still think they make good cars and they're pretty reliable and they're worth the money, then actually that was a blip. They still had to rebuild trust and say that they were taking action. Again, we can come on to this as well, but the what you do side of things if it starts unraveling. But because they were seen to take action, worked with the regulatory authorities, paid the fines, but fundamentally their product was good and people still had trust and faith in it, they could recover.
Yes, look, that makes total sense. And I think we see that there's lots of contemporary examples. There was something you said there around unexpected things that can happen. And I guess for me, that makes me think as to how the internet itself operates. Now, a really good one that's come to my mind while you were speaking there, I think it was Dove. Dove, the kind of deodorants and body wash
beauty
and
products
things like that. Yeah. And so they had a very, very, very deep metaphorical bank account. They had this incredibly brilliant, successful campaign called Real Beauty, where they took away all the fake stuff, and that gave them so much cred. But I think it was a few years ago now, they released this advert. And what it showed was this, do you know the one? It was a series of women and they were all taking their t-shirt off and they became a woman of a different race in the next scene. And it had a sequence. So it wasn't anyone that was called out in particular. It was just demonstrating this is a product for all women. It works the same for everybody. Now, the crisis, as I think that you already know about, was that somebody took the snippet of it, which was an African American woman, I believe, took the t-shirt off and became a white woman. Now, you look at that in isolation and you could see it looks awful. The optics of that are terrible. But in the context of the wider piece, it feels a little bit innocuous to me. Maybe the step change was a bit on the nose, but I don't think there was really any ill intent done with that. But as we've said, this is the power of the users online. Someone can snippet that, turn it into an outrage piece of content, and that's spread around the world almost instantly. That is just an insane crisis when no amount of apology is enough to get that off your plate at that point in time. In situations like that, whether it's governments, organizations, individuals, how do they deal with things like that? We've seen whether it's a celebrity that might have done something and they do this apology and everyone's like, that's PR'd. No one buys it. You know what I mean? Everyone thinks it's fake. What are some of the approaches that they can do if they're really serious about getting back on track with people in the world?
I think, first of all, it's about having a good relationship with your, I say stakeholders, but people generally, like Dove in that instance, they could put it down and it was a mistake. Everybody makes mistakes, but it's what you do afterwards. How do you rectify that error? And you see some organizations, some individuals will have sort of, zero empathy. Don't know what's going on here. I'm just going to plow on regardless. And I will just try and PR my way out of it. In that instance, dropping the ad. We'll look at how that process, how it was storyboard developed in the first place and what the checks and balances are to make sure that doesn't happen again. So people go, well, on the basis of actually, we think they're quite a good brand anyway. They've taken some really swift action. Therefore, we'll give them the benefit of the doubt. So there will be a hit, of course, but it probably won't be that big. Even sometimes a bit of bad publicity like that can actually be beneficial because it reminds people of all the good work that you've done as well, which you may also do in those sort of statements. You may also say, look, we've done some brilliant work here. We've put lots of time and effort into whatever program it happens to be, but we got this wrong. It just went wrong. We don't know why it went wrong. We'll find out why it went wrong. And actually, we'll have an investigation. It'll be independent and we'll publish and we'll be really open and transparent so you can see exactly what went wrong and how we're dealing with it. That's the sort of thing that people will want to see. Not everybody does that. And at some point, it's just a case of, look, just sort of make the thing go away. There's a particular retailer, online retailer, consistently sort of challenged about the sourcing of products, ethical standards in procurement, the way it treats workers as part of that, how much they pay and all that sort of stuff. And that issue has come back several times. Again, they have to keep getting themselves out of this problem. It has cost people their jobs, so leadership teams have gone. So there are consequences for this. And by keeping the feet to the flame, by keeping that pressure on them, I think it's activist groups more than anything, means that they have now to take action and will change their methods. So it does have an effect.
You said a few things in there that got me thinking. One was that you show a little bit of contrition, a bit of genuineness, and it serves as a reminder of all the other good stuff. Now, my brain there went to what a good strategy that is to purposely demonstrate some flaws to make all your good stuff look better. And I don't know if anyone, is willing to kind of take on that risk, but it feels like, could be viable in certain instances. But I think it also got me thinking about, you said something there around whether people can try and avoid it, ignore it, hope it goes away. Now, I think for me, one of the crazy things about the way that the internet and technology and users affect this entire space is that in the online space, once someone smells blood, it's a feeding frenzy. And it's like everyone wants to see that person crucified in the town square. Now, whether they get the apology that they want, whether they want somebody fired, we don't know. I think it's because it's so easy to get involved. All it takes for you to join in something on that online is as little as a like or a repost or a share. Now, I have seen it said, and I've read, if that kind of mob is coming for you and you're, I guess, a normal person, never apologize, because that's exactly what they're trying to effectively bully out of you. Now, of course, if you've done certain bad things, I'm sure an apology is in order. But if you've just made a human error and you've got a mob coming after you, all they want out of you is an apology. Is that a viable strategy? Just to ignore it, and they'll eventually move on to the next one in about 5 minutes.
Instinctively, no. I mean, I'm just trying to, so as you were saying, I'm trying to think of examples. I mean, look, it's mainly politicians, if I'm being brutally honest about this no apology thing. So you never admit. Look, we've had lots of campaigns here in the UK. We've had lots of prime ministers recently. The idea being the Brexit vote, put it on the side of a bus. You put an outrageous number that is about how much we contributed when we were in the European Union to the European Union. It's wrong. It's not the number, but it doesn't matter. Because you are now talking about that particular issue. So instead of saying, look, I'm really sorry we got it wrong, because naturally now we've changed the terms of that conversation and we're now talking about the number, which is actually lower, but it's what we want you to talk about. So I think that comes more from political things. In other words, if you are seen to have got something wrong or not behaving in a particular way, you just try and simply explain it away and move on to the next thing. And you just fill the void with just stuff. It's just too much for anybody to take real attention to.
One of the things that I do notice is that it seems that every single government announcement, whether it is through, I guess, your mainstream media, social media, anywhere online, no one's buying it. How do they get around this? Do you know what I mean? Do they ignore all the negativity coming their way, or do they just plow through it and it's just kind of like an A at B conversation?
Again, it's really difficult because there is no doubt that there's a lack of trust in politics, politicians, business as well, journalists. Just reading some stats this morning about the way that supporters of political parties here in the UK view the different media channels. And, it's clear that the more that you go to the, I suppose, challenger parties, the less belief they have in the mainstream media, additional brands, and they have their own particular favourites. So that lack of trust is absolutely there. How do you overcome that? If you can start showing that you have been changing lives, that you are investing in or cutting waiting lists on the National Health Service, or you are delivering opportunities for younger people, youth unemployment, those sorts of things. So you're making a concrete difference. That will start to rebuild trust. There's always cynicism about politics, so that's always there. But it is a problem because people just don't like politicians at the moment.
Yeah. Look, I think that's universal. It's exactly the same here. And, I've spoken to Americans, and obviously we know what's going on there. But you also mentioned there around businesses. How is things like SEO made reputation management easier, or maybe it's made it more difficult? Can you buy your way out of anything bad by simply burying it?
I think we all have to be aware of that anybody that's involved in communications, marketing, etc., is the ethics side of things. Does that organisation behave in the way that it says it does? If you say that you behave in a certain way, offer a certain level of goods, treat the environment in a certain way, then that's what you live by. Where a gap emerges between the what you say and what you do, and that's when the problem comes. You can take a little dip away because, of course, you have independent rules. Again, back to that, how do we prove these things, etc. But if consistently that gap is there, maybe deliberately by some companies, that's a problem. That's a problem for us as individual practitioners and our ethics, but that's a problem for the companies and the business, and they will be found out eventually because of that nature of that online challenge, because of the very democratized, decentralized sort of way that these things work. You will be found out because there are a lot of people sitting in a lot of chairs, looking at a lot of screens, and some people are really motivated to absolutely look at everything that business does.
No, absolutely. And I think that kind of goes back to what we were saying before, like once there's a little sniff of blood, like everyone wants to see someone fail. It seems to be much more entertaining than building somebody up. But you also mentioned ethics there too. And I'm sure like everything, there's going to be people that operate outside that, putting aside the kind of the ethical concerns of using AI in certain ways. One of the things that we've seen is the explosion recently of AI generated content online. One of the discussions we've had here a little while ago was around it being used to make likenesses of politicians. We've seen the way it can just make stuff and attribute it to whether it's a person, a brand, an organization, what have you. Because this is getting so much better, faster, more sophisticated in what it can do, what kind of challenges is this going to present when you really don't know where it's come from and, more importantly, if it is real or not? Like, what thoughts are already happening around this?
Yeah, I mean, again, AI, deepfakes, videos, audio, that impacts on all of us every day. Mm-hmm. We are all under greater threat from somebody bringing my phone, saying it's my son, deep fake, I need money now, can you transfer it to me? Companies have fallen for that sort of thing before because it sounds genuine.
Absolutely.
Obviously, sexually explicit content as well, particularly for women. And then you add in that lack of trust in politicians and then this sort of undercover audio which claims to have somebody saying something outrageous, etc., that isn't true. So what do we do about that? If they've got some way to counter that, if they have some way that you can genuinely say quickly, that's not true. This isn't us. That's important. But the other thing is if this seems something completely different from their usual way of doing things, or, suddenly they have a view about an issue that they haven't talked about before, it just seems a bit weird. Therefore, you question it when you see it. You think, really? Is that something they would do? Again, that's part of that. Back to where we started, Gareth, but part of that constant vigilance piece. If I see stuff that is rubbish, I do something about it. I don't just let it fester and grow, and then people start sharing it, and it sticks going there. No, you put it down. Get in contact with the channel and say, take this down. Get rid of this. This isn't true. This is damaging. At least you can then say, as part of your explanation, this isn't true, and I've taken action and I'm getting it taken down.
Yes. I mean, that makes total sense. And there was a couple of things I'd love to explore on that. Firstly there, one, does that constant vigilance and the risk of something coming out or being exposed, is that having a tendency to make people actually more honest and legit, because they don't have such an opaque, I guess, way to hide everything. Now it's kind of 24/7. But importantly, again, you said something there around getting stuff taken down. We know through the pandemic, there was all sorts of stuff, whether it was rumors, information, whatever, just spread in all different kind of directions. And we know that, especially in the US, governments have pressured these platforms to take down narratives or whatever it is that are in conflict with the government of the day. Do governments use this kind of like pressure campaigns to, I guess, shoo away anything that could damage them? I mean, I'm sure that there is, but is this a thing that goes on? Like every government would do this?
That's any technology can be used positively or negatively. So, has the internet opened up opportunities for us to be more involved in keeping businesses to account and governments to account because there's more transparency, more emphasis on information. So I have more opportunity to get involved. Yeah. And that's fantastic. So we can all be much more activist, if you want to use that word, in the way that we deal with things. can that same technology also be used to close down dissent or misused, which I think is also I think you were hedging towards it, which is the sort of so I would just sort of know. I mean, and the answer, of course, is yes. Of course, it can be. Look, some countries just simply turn off the internet, don't they? And then therefore people can't communicate anymore. But when politicians themselves don't use facts, when they are leaning into that slightly conspiratorial, vaccines, for instance, as a classic case in point at the moment, sadly, then you could say that's the misuse of the platform as well. I don't know. I mean, maybe it's a bit too broad, a bit too philosophical, but so I think the answer is yes. It can be used for good and it can be used for bad. That's the simplistic way. And then on top of that, there's all these nuances to those discussions, I think.
No, absolutely. I think you get where I was going with this, and it was more around the influence that governments and companies at those very, very top echelons have to be able to kind of be doing that and controlling a narrative that is out there. But moving on, one thing I wanted to ask you was about the concept of reputation launderers. Can you explain what they are and what they do and tools and techniques they use?
Well, I suppose, they come in all sorts of different shapes and forms, and what we tend to think of them nowadays are these sort of influencer types. Where a business will work with an influencer to try and say this is the real story about this particular company or country. The argument has been made that certainly for some countries in the Middle East, they have values or way of working or lack of democracy that other countries may not feel particularly comfortable with. And therefore, how do you overcome that? You sort of work with, and I'll come back to launderers as well, because that sort of suggests there's something nefarious about that, but I'll come back to that in a second. So, but you would work with, you find ways to effectively show a more positive view of that country to the outside world. So you sponsor sport events, you sponsor groups of comedians going across and doing these sorts of things. You will have some people that say that you are sort of laundering in some way the image or sports washing, greenwashing, whatever it happens to be, that particular reputation. Others will say, no, what we're doing is we're using this platform to show that actually we're very different to what we were 10, 20, 30 years ago, if even that was true. But the sort of the laundering idea suggests that, again, there's something that's not really changed. So the activist side of things, those that pay particular attention to maybe some of those countries will say, actually, look, you know what? It hasn't changed that much. So don't be fooled by this idea that just because they've got a comedy session that suddenly the free speech is there and you can challenge powers that be, etc. Because that's not true type thing. So they will try and keep that going. But that laundering idea, I think, does suggest there's something slightly nefarious about it. And effectively, they're just taking the cash to show that place or that company in a better light.
That's the exact point.
And they shouldn't be.
For me, I was curious because it does sound, nefarious, but at the end of the day, it just sounds like you're looking for good PR opportunities, and that makes total sense. So it sounds a lot cooler than the reality.
And Gareth, those influencers, if you want to put it like that, will be, they will talk to a particular community or they will talk to a particular group of young people that they listed. So, a company coming along and working with you on something that audience values is no bad thing. That can be a really useful tool, and not at all nefarious. Now, but there are challenges. So sometimes, if we look at some of the regulators here in terms of advertising, where a company will often work with an influencer and they'll do something on Instagram or whatever, and it doesn't get labeled as an advert. So there is a financial transaction that's taken place between that business and that influencer, and they don't mark it as an ad. The regulators have said they should do, but that still comes up every now and again. Now, to me, that's unethical, and that does feel nefarious because effectively you're not communicating transparently with that audience, but that's easily overcome. You tag it, you show them properly, I've got a relationship with this business, but I'm still prepared to talk to you, my audience, about this particular thing.
Yeah, look, transparency. Again, that makes total sense too, simply because there is an inherent cynicism with people, whether they're looking at companies or brands or governments. Like people just, you're automatically feel like coming at a place from distrust. I mean, that's something that the internet and technology has enabled infinite fold. But one thing, again, I wanted to ask you around, just for anybody that might not be aware, what would you say are the telltale signs of a coordinated smear campaign or attack on whether it's a person or a business, a government, whatever, in the digital space? What do they look like, the obvious tells?
Well, names on social media aren't names. Weird name with lots of numbers and letters and X's after the end of it, that sort of thing. Pictures that are, I can use a particular example from the UK, but I won't do because I get into trouble, so I'm not going to. But just obviously made up fake pictures that may play on particular themes of the time. That's when it's not real, or you've got a fair chance of it not being real. Now, again, does that stop the media following it? No, not necessarily. But it means that it's part of your argument. You can say, look, we've looked at these people and actually they aren't people, they're bots. This is some sort of organized campaign against us for whatever reason. But again, doesn't get over the fundamentals. If you know your business, if you know your organization, if you know your people and you have the policies, the processes in place, even if that is the case, you can still argue against it clearly and forcefully.
Right. That's interesting to hear, especially thinking about the way that I guess the digital space operates, where it is that slightly bizarre, surreal, kind of meme-driven culture. Like people leaning into these absurdities and rather than kind of running away from them. So how do you think things will play out? Now, we know there's bot farms and all sorts of ways of launching these digital attacks, whether they're cyber attacks or smear campaigns, whatever it is. But how do you think things play out in the digital landscape as technology, whether it's AI or anything else, continues to get more autonomous and less human? Where is that going to take us, do you reckon?
That's a really tough question. We talked about the sort of us individually as activists. Now, that becomes even more effective when I can stick an AI onto helping me do that. I can be even more granular than I was before. So I can be less expert, but actually more effective. When it comes back to the company, that means they absolutely have to be on top of everything in a way that the activist is as well, or the challenger is. Maybe that helps everybody to know their business much better than they currently do. So, again, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but I think that could be partly a consequence of that as well. But the more that, if it's just sort of AI-generated content in that sense, then the more noise there is, the more that human element, the more that the real challenge, the human story, which is already what drives most of us and media nowadays, becomes even more important. So in some way, maybe this is the positive way, but in some way, that is the really positive side of this, is that humanity part becomes more important again and, cuts through the AI noise. It's the human side.
Yep. Look, totally agree. I like to think of it in that optimist sense too, that eventually that humanity, that's what's going to shake out of all of this as the most important part of it. But on that note, if you could give everyone one piece of advice, they were potentially concerned about the way that their reputation could be affected in the digital space, what piece of advice would you offer them as the most important?
Be honest with yourself. Whether you're an individual or a business, take time to reflect. And if you aren't doing something right and you can see you're not doing it right, do something about it before it becomes a problem. We often don't do that. And I think, that for reputation side of things, massively helpful. And even if it's difficult, you still do something about it. Again, look, all of us as individuals, we do shy away from these things sometimes.
What's that saying?
Just because it's difficult.
The saying that the only way out is through. So take it on, see what you can get done.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Look, thanks so much for that, Stuart. What have you got coming up and where can people follow what you're up to?
Well, I'm on, as you would probably expect, all good platforms. LinkedIn is probably a good one, but I'm on others as well. And my website's for my business, CWE Communications. But yeah, look, I'm very happy to have follow-up discussion with people. So if they want to connect, then just reach out, we'll do that. And obviously, if they want to buy a book, then we'll have to do that. Available at all good retailers, probably online.
We'll drop the link in the show notes. Stuart, thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed our time, so thank you very much.
For more info on what we've discussed today, check out the show notes. If you enjoyed this one, you can subscribe to Ruined by the Internet on your favourite podcast app and help spread the word by sharing this episode or leaving a review. I'm Gareth King. See you next time.